A short story so pointless, that's the point. Or it's the motivating factor, at least. Welcome to Strip Cover Lit, where we squeeze the bigger picture out of literature. I'm Adrian Fort, and we're here for another short story discussion, which will appear in two playlists here on the channel. Number one, the short story discussion playlist, but number two, a short story by short story read along of the Finca Vigia edition of Ernest Hemingway's complete short stories, one by one through the canon of Papa. The short story in question today is Big Two-Hearted River by Ernest Hemingway. And this video will have three sections: a So What Happened recap, a literary criticism section, and a writer's corner where we talk about what we can take from this short story as a writer. So, what happened in Big Two-Hearted River by Ernest Hemingway? There's been a fire. Devastating, forest clearing fire. And Nick Adams is headed into the aftermath. He marches along not far from the river and finds a place to set up camp. He pitches his tent, he plays with some grasshoppers, he makes coffee, and he eats a lot. He eats a can of spaghetti, a can of pork and beans, some ketchup, some slices of bread, a can of apricots, and drinks the juice, and he makes some coffee. And he goes to sleep. That is it. But, as always with Ernest Hemingway, there is more going on than that. So, into the literary criticism portion of this video, I think it's very easy to read this short story and end up thinking, so what? This is a pointless short story. This is one of those short stories for which Ernest Hemingway is constantly criticized, where it's just some kid in the woods. And I think that is a bit short-sighted. There we go. But I want to start here. This is where I want to start. As Nick is marching along, trying to set up camp, we get this. His muscles ached and the day was hot, but Nick felt happy. He felt he had left everything behind. The need for thinking, the need to write, other needs. It was all back of him. We get from this that there is something going wrong in Nick's life. Nick is here in this burnt-out forest trying to escape, trying to get away from something. But what? What could it be that is bothering Nick? So let's flash back to the opening paragraph. The train went on up the track, out of sight, around one of the hills of burnt-out timber. Nick sat down on the bundle of canvas and bedding the baggage man had pitched out of the door of the baggage car. There was no town, nothing but the rails and the burned-over country. 13 saloons had lined the one street of Seney, had not left a trace. The foundations of the Mansion House Hotel stuck up above the ground. The stone was chipped and split by the fire. And it was all that was left of the town of Seney. Even the surface had been burned off the ground. So there's been a ravenous wildfire, and what does this ravenous wildfire represent? Well, it represents whatever it is that is tearing asunder Nick's world at the moment. His world feels burned out. He is going to escape from this, and he must get away from everything. He feels he has to escape and reset himself. He has to get out in nature and reset what it is that makes Nick Adams, Nick Adams. He has to reconnect with the self. He has to go to this place he had once traversed. He knows the town. He knew the town before it was burnt out. And now he is going to the ghost town to find himself. Then we get this, which is kind of curious. If you know Nick Adams, if you are familiar with other Nick Adams stories, this would be a troubling detail. If, however, you are only taking this short story into account, which as a reader, that's all you're responsible for, is the one story you have at a time, you will notice this. On 168 of the Fincavigia edition, all right, he took out a spoonful from the plate. Christ, Nick said. Jesus Christ, he said happily. He ate the whole plate full before remembering the bread. Nick finished the second plateful with the bread, mopping the plate shiny. He had not eaten since a cup of coffee and a ham sandwich in the station restaurant. He had eaten it. Pardon me. Since a ham sandwich and a coffee he had at the station restaurant in St. Ignace. It had been a very fine experience. Had he been that hungry before, but had not been able to satisfy it? He could have made camp hours before he wanted to. There were plenty of places to go on the river, but this was good. Now, that will strike you if you have read other Nick Adams stories, but if you have not read other Nick Adams stories, you will recognize that he has been walking along the river looking at the fish. We know that Nick is a fisherman. We know that Nick is a fisherman from other stories, but if we don't have those other stories, we know simply from his observations about the trout in the river that he knows what he's looking at. We can pick up the fact that he's preoccupied with the trout and would tell us what they were doing. He is a fisherman. He would have come with his fishing gear. You would have to if you were planning on staying out in the wilderness for any period of time. You have this food, these cans of food with you as reserves. So why not fish while you can? Catch the fish, cook the fish, eat the fish, and save your resources in case you get hungry later. What if you can't catch anything after you've made camp? Then you have to go back. Then you have to go hungry. You have to forsake whatever the rest of the trip was that you were there to do. The cans, however, represent pretension and preparedness. These were the food, the things he had brought with him. Out in the wilderness, he is ready to eat those things. He is hungry. He is, once again, restored to the place of being hungry. If you've been anxious or down for any period of time, you know that sometimes food is not the first thing that you're thinking about. You will forget to eat. Nick has neglected to eat. That's why he finds himself so ravenous so early in this trip. Instead of catching food and preparing it, saving his reserves, he digs right into his reserves and starts eating everything. Eats can after can of food. The stuff you're dragging around with you, in this case, represents his anxiety. So instead of digging into the wilderness, he digs into his reserves, the things that he has brought with him, his anxieties, taken them out of his pack and started eating them up immediately. Still, something is the bother. We have this. He would not let it steep in the pot at all. Not the first cup. It should be straight Hopkins all the way. Hop deserved that. He was a very serious coffee drinker. He was the most serious man Nick had ever known. Not heavy serious. That was a long time ago. Hopkins spoke without moving his lips. He played polo. He made millions of dollars in Texas. He had borrowed car fare to go to Chicago when the wire came that his first big well had come in. He could have wired for money. That would have been too slow. They called Hop's girl the blonde Venus. Hop did not mind because she was not his real girl. Hopkins had said very confidently that none of them would would make fun of his real girl. He was right. Hopkins went away when the telegram came. That was on the Black River. It took 8 days for the telegram to reach him. Hopkins had given away his .22 caliber Colt automatic pistol to Nick. He gave his camera to Bill. It was to remember him always by. They were all going to go fishing again next summer. The hophead was rich. He would get a yacht, and they would all cruise along the north shore of Lake Superior. He was excited but serious. They said goodbye and all felt bad. It broke up the trip. They never saw Hopkins again. That was a long time ago on the Black River. So, it might be easy from that passage to assume that the bother was that Hopkins was gone. His friend was now rich, and he would not see him again. I, however, believe there is something slightly different at play here. I think that what's going on is that Nick feels he has not made it. He feels that Hopkins, his friend, has already made it. He's rich. He's successful. He has made himself in life. Nick, however, has not. Nick is here backpacking in burnt out country, feeling that his life is asunder. He needs to reconnect with himself. He needs to reconnect with those things that made him who he is so that he can build upon them, rebuild his life the way that a town could be rebuilt after a fire. This town that he finds himself in has not been rebuilt. Nick feels that he has not rebuilt his life, constructed his life, made a success of himself. He feels that his life is barren. He is not successful. His friends have already made it. This attempt to go to the woods and find himself, this attempt to go to the woods and reconnect with those building blocks of his own life, wilderness and fishing and camping, these sorts of things, are what he needs to reconstruct the self. So, at the end of this, carrying all of this anxiety with him, unable to think, unable to write, unable to sleep, he goes to the woods and has this worked? Well, we get this final paragraph. Out through the front of the tent, he watched the glow of the fire when the night wind blew on it. It was a quiet night. The swamp was perfectly quiet. Nick stretched under the blanket comfortably. A mosquito, a mosquito close to his ear. Nick sat up and lit a match. He used those tools, the cheesecloth to block out the mosquitoes. Nick moved the mosquito was over his head. Nick moved the match quickly up to it. He uses the tools that he has learned in his life to move past. The mosquito made a satisfactory hiss in the flame. The match went out. Nick lay down again under the blanket. He turned on his side and shut his eyes. He was sleepy. He felt sleep coming. He curled up under the blanket and went to sleep. Nick has escaped the bothers of the world, the fact that he feels troubled and unsuccessful, maybe feels like a loser. He is reconnected with those things that make him who he is, and now he is able to use the tools, the match, the cheesecloth, setting up the tent, to sleep. That, I think, is what is going on in this short story. Nick is troubled, reconnects with his roots, and finds that peace. That is what Nick needed. Now, the only writer's corner note that I have for this is that it's smooth. It's a little bit, the writing itself can be a little bit choppy because it's Hemingway and he's going to use short declarative sentences. He's not going to tell you what Nick is thinking at all times. He's going to give you what Nick is doing, and you are left to intuit what is roiling under the surface. That is what happens in this short story, and it gets off to such a smooth start, but such a you're moving the whole time. You're not stuck in Nick's head. You're moving. The baggage man threw his stuff out. He sat on his stuff. He moved his stuff. He watched the fish. It's so smooth that you don't realize you've spent the first 3 pages of this short story watching the trout in the river. It's, I believe, a 9-page short story, and you spend at least 3 pages just walking along the water and watching. This lulls the reader, the audience, to sleep in this short story, so that by the time it's over, just 6 pages later, you're left wondering what just happened. Now, that can be a positive and a negative. It is very smooth. It is written very well. It is always moving, but this was done so well by Ernest Hemingway, it may have ruined it for the rest of us. If you submit a short story like this to a publication today, likely they're not going to get to that 4th page. You don't have Ernest Hemingway's name. You have not collected that grace from editors to make your statement as such. Maybe that has in some way ruined publication because writers are not allowed to make the statements they want. But I think that if you do it well enough, maybe you get that grace. It is, in my opinion, however, necessary to the story that upon the first read, you can sit back and think, well, that was a pointless 9 pages. Why did I invest that? Because it is an underhanded goal of Hemingway that this is not an immediate realization. That is all I have from Big Two-Hearted River Part 1 by Ernest Hemingway. The next video in this series will be Big Two-Hearted River Part 2. If you like or appreciate what it is that I do here, hitting the like button really does help me out, as it tells YouTube to share this video with other literature lovers. If you find yourself here by chance but not design, there's literature on the channel every week. There's poetry every Monday, and I hope to have you back for the next one.